I'm glad you could come. I see a lot of our community partners are with us today. That's wonderful. Thank you for coming out. This is our second Arnold Aging Lecture, sponsored by a very generous endowment from Jerry Sue and Norman Arnold 3 years ago. They made a substantial, about a $7 million gift to the school to establish actually 2 lecture series, one in children's and adolescents obesity prevention, and then this lecture in healthy aging. I'm delighted that Keith Whitfield is with us today. I'm glad we were able to get you out of Detroit. We do very well bringing people down from Michigan in February and March. And Mindy will make a few remarks about Keith in a moment. But, he's a provost at present, and you know, we're searching for a president here.
I mentioned that.
We might just turn this into a job interview. Anyway, but thank you all for coming out. I'm not going to talk too much at this point. What I would like to do, though, is recognize Danielle Friedman and Lee Pearson. They co-direct our Office for the Study of Aging. That office has been going now for a long time. It may be almost as old as the Arnold School. It houses the Alzheimer's Disease Registry, and that office does a lot of good work in healthy aging for the citizens of South Carolina. We're also particularly proud of the emphasis that they have looking at health disparities, looking at social determinants. Dr. Whitfield's talk today is very apropos to what the office is about. We also have an associate director for research in the office. That's Professor Mindy Spencer. Mindy has known Keith for a while, and Mindy, I've asked you to come up and introduce Dr. Whitfield at this time. Again, thank you all for coming out.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. So thank you, Dean Chandler, and thank you all for being here at the second annual Arnold Aging Lecture. Special shout out to our community partners who have joined us, and also to my students from Southern Discomfort who made that long trek from 300 Main to join us today. So I can't express what a personal honor it is to introduce our keynote speaker. Keith Whitfield earned his bachelor's in psychology from the College of Santa Fe, a Ph.D. in lifespan developmental psychology from Texas Tech, and his postdoctoral training in quantitative genetics from the University of Colorado at Boulder. He became the provost of Wayne State University in 2016. Prior to that, he was vice provost for academic affairs at Duke University. Among some of his many appointments at Duke, he served as a professor in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience, and co-directed the Center on BioBehavioral Health Disparities Research. An expert on aging among African Americans, Dr. Whitfield has published over 200 articles, books, and book chapters on cognition, health, and the intersection of genes and environment on individual development. Trust me when I say that we would all be here collectively aging if I were to name all of his many contributions to the field of gerontology. Just a few highlights, though. Dr. Whitfield is a fellow of the Gerontological Society of America, or GSA, as many of us know it as, and that represents the highest category of membership within the society. He is also the former chair of GSA's BioBehavioral and Social Sciences section and the Task Force on Minority Issues in Gerontology. Just last year, he was the recipient of GSA's Robert W. Kleemeyer Award in recognition for outstanding research in the field of gerontology. Dr. Whitfield has made it his goal to take the art of mentoring to a new level. In 2013, he developed the Mentoring Effect, a special project of GSA Innovation Fund to exclusively support mentorship within the society. He was the architect of GSA's Speed Mentoring Program and has personally mentored junior scholars and colleagues from around the world. He co-edited the Handbook on Minority Aging, whose entire editorial staff consisted of junior and senior collaborators. And in recognition for his efforts, he has been awarded GSA's Distinguished Mentorship in Gerontology Award, as well as the Minority Issues in Gerontology Outstanding Mentorship Award. Now, I'm sure everyone is wondering how I know this guy. So, and last night at dinner, we were doing the math, and it turns out that almost 20 years ago, before I could even legally buy a drink, Dr. Whitfield took a chance on a girl from West Virginia in the American Psychological Association Minority Aging Network in Psychology, which was a week-long training at Penn State University. And that was kind of the beginning, and the rest is history. He taught me everything that I know about authentic mentorship. And when I was looking back through some emails, some rather dated emails, when I was really professional, I think my email address was mostrighteousbabe@gmail.com. And this is a quote. "So you're actually graduating and about to take the world by storm. I'm sure your parents are proud, maybe even more so than me, if you can imagine that. He has always had my back, and he's always had my brain, and he has always had my heart." And without further ado, Dr. Keith Whitfield.
Thank you so much, Mindy. Thank you so much, Dean. Can everyone hear me? I have another level, so if you need to hear, you find as Provost that sometimes you have to, I was going to say carry a big stick and talk loudly, but more than anything, just talk really loud. So thank you so much. That's actually probably, I told her, that's one of the best introductions I've had. I might take her on the road with me. So I do have to take pause, and I'm going to be in so much trouble because I like to talk. And I've got a bunch of slides to show you, but we're going to get through all of them. Some of them really quickly. If we need to, we'll go back. But I heard that this is a wonderful lecture. I've heard about it before. I actually heard about it its first year. But I didn't hear that there's $7 million. I just filled out my whatever, and I'm thinking, I'm putting in my retirement. I'm done. I've got the $7 million. It's fantastic. I'm very happy to be here today. So what I'm going to do is to try to take on a very, very quick look at thinking about biobehavioral insights on health and aging among African Americans. And I'm going to give you my perspective on things. I will say that a lot of what I'm going to show you is my work. It's not other people's work, because I know my work better than their work. So bear with me, and we can talk about how it's relevant to other things, but just know that that's where we're going to couch it at. So let's start off with thinking about what other people do say about health disparities. And when you look at Healthy People 2020, defines health disparity as a particular type of health difference that is closely linked with social, economic, and environmental disadvantage. Now, and they've also put out, the CDC's put out, this idea of looking at social determinants of health and thinking about all of those different things and how they interplay with one another and how they ultimately create the kinds of differences that we see as we look across different groups. This is probably most easily seen as we look at life expectancy. If you're going to study health, the primary indicator is whether you get to live long enough to be able to talk about it. And so as we look, we see persistent, this is since 1900, persistent differences in black and white life expectancy. We see a little bit of advantage or increasing advantage among African American women, but for men, particularly between black and white men, that difference has stayed pretty consistent over time. And we'll come back and talk about why that might be a little bit later. So what's fascinating is that that's looking at differences between groups. But actually, as we look at those differences between groups, a very funny thing happens. And this is work that's been done by folks at Duke. And that, yes, you find those differences in life expectancy as you go from 40 to 60, but when you hit, actually that year is supposed to be about 82 years. At 82 years, you start to find that the life expectancy going forward is about even for blacks and whites. And interesting and very controversial. When you get to about 90, there's actually a black advantage. Now, if we want to think about healthy aging, we need to know what's going on with black people in later life. We need to know what happens as they get up to and try to get up to 80, and what kinds of things happen. So we're going to talk about some of what I believe that exists today. But when we get to that point, we've usually gotten into it by always thinking about comparing blacks to whites, blacks to whites, blacks to whites. Actually, I always get a little underwhelmed by for my Hispanic brothers and sisters, where we don't say, well, what does it look like in terms of black, white, and brown people? And maybe there's some insight to be gathered from that. But I'd step back even and say, okay, so you're comparing two different groups. Actually, think about it. They are two different groups. So we start off with a preconceived notion that there are differences between the groups. And then, guess what? We compare them, and there's a difference. Oh my gosh. Stop the presses. This is great news. Or is it? Is it really? Actually, and I get this from a lot of people saying, well, you know, Keith, you need to compare black people to white people. And I was like, okay, how many students are there in this audience? See, you had to think about it for a second. That's a little scary. So what are you told with your stats? The first thing you're told to do with data is to plot it. Almost nobody does. You're like, oh, I guess we were told that, but I don't do that. You're supposed to plot it. Well, if you plot data coming from Americans Changing Lives and looking at, I study cognition, amongst other things. So I plotted black and white, and I plotted it and took a look at it. Tell me, what is your observation of those two different plots of the data? Mumbling doesn't ever cut it. Come on. What's that? Similar means that they're different. They're kind of the same, but they're not the same. I would argue that the black folks look a whole lot more varied. You have more scatter, okay? Now, in theory, actually, when you put this to a test of homogeneity of variance, you find it fails. And very simple analysis of variance tells us we're not supposed to do comparisons if you don't have homogeneity of variance. Because there's something going on. It's not just A times, difference from B. It's that A prime and B, and there's some weird things going on in one group, or different things maybe going on in one group, that's not happening in the other group. So in theory, and boy, I'm really just arguing that that's why I do what I do, you're kind of not supposed to compare them. At least on that, you're not supposed to. So if we're not going to do that, what do? We have to take a look at who we're studying. We have to actually ask them some questions and really find out, because I think that we just use the groups as groupings and just take the variables that we always look at and just say, is there a difference? And we know from the beginning, at least most of the time, we assume that there's a difference. Sometimes we even add another group in there so that we can find a difference, because if we can find a difference, we can get the paper published. Because you can't get papers published if there's no difference. Because people say, so what? So we've got to take a look at them. We've got to see who the people behind those data points actually are. And when we do that, we actually can't then just, if we know the variance is a little different, we've got to figure out what is going on. As we look through a cultural lens, we may find, like for sensory systems, maybe they're the same. You got 2 eyes and a nose, and yeah, most people have 2 eyes and a nose in both groups. Okay, it's the same. But we also may find, like for physical health, that yeah, people get cardiovascular disease, but African Americans have higher rates of it. Or we may have hypertension, but African Americans have a higher rate of it. Why? The question needs to be why. So, what I planned to share with you today, and I was sharing earlier about how bad I am now with doing presentations, because it's like not to the last minute do I realize what I actually want to do. So I'm like, oh, I should share with them what I plan to do. I want to be able to share a perspective with you about how to advance the study of health among older African Americans. I want to propose a biobehavioral model to you, talk a little bit about risk for poor health, provide you some examples from my previous work, and share a little bit of what I'm working on right now. So, we got to do some assumptions, and I apologize. I hate slides where there's just nothing but stuff to read. Just bear with me. This is the only one that's like that. Okay, so first, the assumption that historical and life circumstances experienced by African Americans create unique patterns of health that in many cases can be observed as disparities when compared to whites. Next is that comparisons typically don't identify sources of what creates the difference. We just say that there's a difference. Third, that health in later life can most accurately be understood using a model that includes intersections between biological, behavioral, and social factors. And the combination and intersection of these factors creates individual variability in the course of aging in later life. So this should be like 20 other slides, but I'm just kind of trying to get you to where I need to get you to so we can go forward. Okay, so those are some assumptions that we have. And if we have those assumptions, we can use something, a biobehavioral model, and talk about the convergence of those sorts of things and lay it out very, very simplistically. Actually, there's not enough lines up there. There should be other lines up there. But the idea of things like personality and genetics and social factors and cognition, mental health, all have an impact on health. That trying to separate them out tends to be artificial. Those typically are sources of explanatory factors that actually can help us better understand health. Now, when we talk about health, I'm going to try to limit it. You could talk about a million things. I'm going to talk about some things around chronic conditions, some physical functioning, and health behaviors. And to do that, I'm going to actually use my research from the past. I know that there's students in the audience, and so I've got to put a particular disclaimer saying don't do what I do. And what I've done, which is that I got so curious that I wanted to understand individual differences in aging, but through the course of my training, I learned how to do it as looking at twin and family studies, but I also learned it studying individuals. So rather than choosing one or the other, I just ended up doing both. So in doing both, I also have sources of primary data. That's data that me or my wonderful colleagues go out and get. Or I have secondary data, meaning that I go up to somebody at a conference and say, hey, fascinating data, can I use it? Now, next test. What do you find interesting up there about these studies that I have listed? Just to move things along, because I have way too much to talk about. Look at where it's at. Yes, I went to Moscow, Russia, and studied twins. People then go, well, wait a minute, you want to study ethnicity and environment? Yeah. At the time, which was 1994, it was the perfect time to go. It was a time when Russia was changing to democracy. And we got to see kind of the post-impact of what communism was supposed to be. The long and the short of it, whole nother presentation, is that guess what? Everything wasn't the same for everybody. There was so much variability, interestingly enough. Came from the environment, but ended up making people different from one another, not necessarily the same as one another. Okay? So, interesting to consider. So, I'm going to talk a lot about the Baltimore Study of Black Aging, give you some examples from the Carolina African American Twin Study of Aging, and then I'm going to conclude and talk about that last study. So, I looked through my presentation, I'm like, I'm giving a bunch of examples, but I'm not giving enough about the data, so I'm going to just give you a real quick overview of one of the data sets. I'm going to talk a little bit more when I get to the family section about the Carolina study, but just to give you some background as you see some of these results. This is the Baltimore Study of Black Aging. I was there from 97 to 2011, even though we still do little bits and pieces. And I keep saying that it's a study, and it sounds funny because it's not a study, it's actually a series of studies. That every time we would get an answer to something, we would have an answer for something else. And so I forgot what it totals up to, but it's, something like 2,400 interviews, 1,700 interviews that we did over that period of time. And it was always to answer different sorts of questions because one study basically led to another. It culminated in a study where we started with 602 and did a longitudinal piece where we got 450 people. So we'll take a couple of examples from there. We'll also take examples from the Carolina African American Twin Study of Aging. And I will, it's so funny, I've talked about this actually even a couple of places around the world, but here I actually have to apologize because, as you will see, Carolina is that other Carolina. Yeah, look, it's you all's fault. I tried to get twins from South Carolina, and I ran into so much bureaucratic red tape. And there was a reason why, and it wasn't even UofSC State. It was a researcher that did bad things, and the state just said, we're not going to let you in and look at our stuff anymore. So it's focused on North Carolina. I actually my staff and I went to registers of deeds, and you can actually pull books off of the shelf and look for twins. Now, the books are about this big, have 800 records in them, and you have to go through each one. We went from 1914, 1917 to 1970. And wrote them down by hand, put them in. We'll talk about it. But just to clarify, it's the other Carolina, okay? I know where I'm at. I know what I'm doing here. So let's first talk about just a piece of that model. These are where the examples that I'm going to provide you come from, of looking at the intersections between health and genetics and also health and cognition. So let's start with that first piece of health and cognition. And actually, I'll offer something because I didn't do it. I try to put citations when necessary down here. If you all are interested in them, please communicate with Mindy. I will create a little bibliography because you can read my stuff and then you can cite my stuff, and that's always good. So let's take this first piece. Let's take that explanation of health and break it out a little bit, because I'm even going to talk even more specifically when it comes to chronic conditions and focus on pulmonary functioning, hypertension, and cardiovascular disease. So first, looking at lung function. See, another citation. Somebody could cite that. Think about it. Okay, so this is using CATSA data. And what we did was to take, it's a twin study, but people are foolish sometimes because they think you can only then just study pairs of twins. But because it uses population-based approaches, it's a great population-based study. So what we did was just randomly take one twin from each pair, and then I'll tell you a little bit more too. They're survivors. You'll get interested in that when we get to it. Took those folks, broke them into older and younger. Younger ended up being folks from 22 to 49, and older 50 and above. And when there are the measures, don't even worry about that. The real part is the results. And that after controlling for education age and pack years, because you need to control for smoking, we're talking about lung function. And actually, we're talking about peak expiratory flow. It's not VO2 max. It's a little bit subtler, but it's a very, very good measure. And it's fascinating because lots of people find what I find, which is that average peak expiratory flow wasn't a significant predictor of cognitive functioning in younger people, but it was in older people, and particularly for our TICS measure, which is a measure of cognitive impairment. And so this group actually, even though there is still actually an advantage, blacks don't get COPD as much as whites do, that it's shrinking over time. That advantage is probably going to turn into a disadvantage in the next 5 years is what the data ends up looking like. But it sure looks like that is a real important function that actually changes cognitive functioning. So we hit this interesting piece about health impacting cognitive functioning. Okay. We can also look at blood pressure. Of course, think about African Americans. See, here comes the asides, and I know I'm getting off track, but I always find it fascinating. I go to the doctor's office for the first time. They have me fill out the health history. And it says, do you have hypertension? And then when you get into the doctor's office, say, well, tell me, what do you have a family history of? I'm black. I have hypertension. Of course. I have a family history of hypertension. Why are you even asking me that? It's like, come on, can we talk about something else? What's your shoe size? Something else like that, okay? So we wanted to take a look and see if blood pressure actually influenced memory. We used, which one did I use? Yeah, that's CATSA. Again, taking individuals 49 and older to make sure that we got folks that did and didn't have hypertension, although when you look at this group, even below 49, you find people that have hypertension. It's one of the growing public health concerns is that in young African Americans, actually you're seeing stroke. You're seeing stroke from uncontrolled hypertension in part. So anyway, we got them, mean age. Sample was wonderfully 38% male, which is very, very hard to achieve. We're always happy about that. I had to have some data up there, so it looks like I know how to, add 2 and 2 or do a regression. When you first look at it, you find that actually there's a relationship between systolic blood pressure and all of these different measures of cognitive functioning. The first one is one of attention. The second one is one of working memory. The third one is speed. The third one is working memory again. The next one is short-term recall. The next one is long-term recall. And then the last one is cognitive impairment. Now, you got to do the right thing. You got to control for other variables. When we control for those other variables, we still do see some stick out. So for that speed measure, the digit symbol, systolic. For the short-term memory, it sticks out. And also for the cognitive impairment, it sticks out. So I basically just said that same thing, that we do find this relationship between blood pressure and cognition. I'll give you the real quick and short and dirty of how we think that plays out. It's the idea that blood pressure is, it's hitting, it can pass the blood-brain barrier, so it can actually influence the blood and the capillaries and everything else that is in the head. And that the damage that occurs, that it creates not big holes, but microvascules, micro little insults. and that when you start starving, when you break them off or they're damaged, they don't provide blood to certain areas of the brain, and so then you start to get dysfunction like speed. How quickly your brain can actually work, if it's got to go heel and dale and everywhere else because it's got to get around damage, it takes a little bit longer, okay? So let's then talk about health and education in our Baltimore study. So education has long been known to have an impact on individual variability on cognitive functioning. Health seems to have an influence on cognitive health as well. So the question then is that with the health disparities literature that suggests that health and education are related, which one is more important? Which one may have a bigger impact? And cut to the quick, what we find is that cardiovascular health in particular and education were independent predictors. That one has an effect, but the other one has an effect too. Once you control for them back and forth, they both have an independent impact on cognitive functioning. And that the measure of cognitive impairment and working memory were the ones that seemed to be the most significantly impacted. So now I'm putting on a little bit of my psychologist hat because I was always curious about social support. We talked a little earlier about caregiving in one of our sessions. And caregiving versus social support, you know, that's a real interesting, fine distinction that some people make. But social support can be things that are not necessarily caregiving, but things that you interact with other people who are in your lives. There's a lot of both truth and myth around kind of the interconnectedness of African American families. Sometimes it's glorified just a little bit. But there is connections that go on. There's lots of aging in place that goes on. And so it's really important to look at social support. And the other variable that I have there, it's a cognitive variable. It's actually everyday problem solving. One of the things that happened so long ago when I first started this is that everybody was telling me about how poorly African Americans did on these standard tests. And I said, that's because the tests are crap. They're not designed for African Americans. And I said, you need something that's more practical, that's not designed and linked so heavily to education, maybe something that, yeah, you do it as a function of what you do in a day. Everyday problem solving is such a thing. It's very interesting that you use measures that solve physical functioning and you ask people to solve those kinds of problems. And so you can look at both the kinds of problems they solve and physical functioning to see if they're independent. And that's sure enough what we actually did. But we started with 3 questions. Do those who receive social support do more poorly on everyday problem solving, meaning that if somebody has to help you out, maybe you don't have the cognition to be able to actually do those sorts of tasks? Does giving social support relate to greater everyday problem solving? Meaning that, you know, when you think about who's going to take care of your kid, do you think about the person who, you know, their memory's failing, they forget their keys, you know, oh, what is, you don't want that taking care of your child. You think about a person taking care of or doing those things that you think has good cognitive functioning. And then lastly is the relationship between social support and everyday problem solving mediated by physical functioning. And again, to show you, I actually used to do lots of data analysis. You use a structural equation modeling, and what you find is that social support out, meaning social support that you're given. If you're giving social support, it predicts better everyday problem solving. Also, those with fewer physical functioning actually predicts everyday problem solving. Kind of makes sense. I just said that same thing, so we're going to the next one. So let's come back to our model. So we started talking about health and cognition. Let's do the next piece, which is taking a look at health and genetics. Now, I find it fascinating. I was sharing with somebody earlier that when I first wanted to start doing and looking at genetics in African Americans, people told me, oh, well, isn't that politically incorrect? And I thought, wait a minute, we're talking about science here, so don't talk about politics. I mean, in the days of Donald Trump, you really kind of say, well, there's alternative news and data, so yeah, of course. It could seem like that, but we need to know some answers. That genetics exist in every human being. There is no one that walks around that doesn't have genes doing something. So why not ask the question? It's perfectly valid. So you can use different ways to be able to get at genetics. You can take someone's blood and do your PCR and be able to look at their genome. In, 2000, we mapped the entire genome. Absolutely, you talk about science just going to the next level of really understanding. We knew the genes were there, but we didn't really have a good map of them. And honestly, we still don't know what all of them do. There's only a portion of them that we think are actually a functional part of the genome, but I don't buy it. I think the part that we think is not functional just does what we don't understand. So there's still lots to learn. You young people out there, there's plenty for you to do. I'm not doing it. So we can use these different types of study designs to be able to get at assumptions about genetics because of the relatedness that we know are in individuals from studying Mendelian genetics. What I'm going to do is to focus on one way to do it, which is the twin designs. Anybody in here a twin? Identical? Fraternal. Fraternal. Opposite sex? No. Same sex. Do they go to school here? No, they do not. Ah, fascinating. And it seems like it's hit or miss when I ask people that, of whether their twin goes to the school or not, or whether they go to a different school. And I almost am so curious I want to study that, but I think I've got enough to do right now. So these guys are both two sets of identical twins, and what I wanted to do was to take the luxury of sharing with you, and so everybody's got to be a psychologist. Everybody in the world needs to be a psychologist. It's like the best thing because you pay attention to stuff. Pay attention to what the twins in this short video do. The other Carolina, that's what we should call it. So what did you notice? Just a couple of observations.
They all sit the same.
They what?
They would sit the same.
They sit the same? Or they even, like the two guys at the front end, they both have kind of the same posture. They're actually, one of them works for the fire department and one of them works for EMS. And it's just, it's weird. And I think one of them was almost like the boss of the other one. That didn't touch that. Anything else?
What about mirroring?
Mirroring?
Left and right.
Even the way that they sit. That I think it's the two guys that they sit like they're supposed to both be looking the same way. Like we just let them sit down, and these were their natural positions, like the women on the couch. Now the women on the couch, it is the most clear version of mirroring, of that they're looking the other direction and they're both pulling their ear. Twins are fascinating. You're fascinating. So you're twins, thank you so much. They're interesting on that behavioral level, but they're also interesting as folks to be able to kind of look at and to think about individual variability. So quantitative genetics uses some very strong assumptions that if you take genetics and put environment together, you account for variability. Environment equals both shared and non-shared. Shared is the environment that they share the same, but they're two different people. This young woman, she's getting an environment that's here at Carolina. Where's your sister at? In Memphis? She's not even at the other Carolina. Oh, I don't know about her. Two different environments. And let's see, all we've got to do is wait about 30 years and we'll come back and we'll study them. And we'll see how alike they are, to see what environment that might have contributed to differences that they might have in health, in education, in perceptions of the world. Very interesting. So we can use designs like adoption, parent, offspring, and twins to be able to get at these assumptions of quantitative genetics. Now, I do like to show this. I put health up there, but I usually use it more than anything else about complex behaviors. People struggle a little bit about how do you get from a gene to behavior. Very, very simple. You start off with DNA, DNA transcribes to RNA, RNA creates proteins, proteins create phenotypes, which are usually the neurotransmitters we think about. Those neurotransmitters create behavior, and then you have to keep in mind, in a real good model, it's these things right here, which is, as in my little picture, they representing as the environment. So that yes, you can have the genes influencing certain biological substrates, but they're definitely, when you get to the phenotype level, those are influencing them too. If I did this right, which I did it on another one and it just makes it confusing, we should have environment at least there, that it has an impact on how proteins actually are produced. Looking at different ways in which genes do what they do, because all genes don't just do one thing. They can be changed, they can change over time, and they can change with the environment. So you're looking at very, very complex relationships. Even more so, this is the same point of that really when you think about it when trying to change your brain chemistry, we really need to think about gene-environment interactions to think about how we change brain chemistry, which ultimately changes behavior. So here are some more of our twins. These ones up at the top are always the most fascinating ones to me. I'll go back. Notice their noses. In North Carolina, there is a tribe that is argued about whether it really is a tribe or not. I think they're still fighting for recognition. Anybody know who they are? My prize student, who is it? Oh, who was it? The Lumbee. And that's one of the characteristic features that you see. What made it a little messy is that some of the Lumbee say, we're not black, we're Native American. And some of the Lumbee say, we're African Americans who happen to have Native American background. Very interesting. Whole nother story. So, twin study. Showed it to you before. Always like to say and give recognition to who brings you to the table, which is the National Institute on Aging. I want to put in this educational piece for our young folks who are in here. I did share it with some other folks. All three of these studies that actually I'm going to talk to you about today, that I've talked to you about, the BSBA, the CATSA, and then the next one, I had to apply 3 times to get them. So it seems ridiculous. I mean, you see how amazing it is. Why wouldn't somebody just do it? Part of it is even the idea of just studying black people, because as you see, they're all studying just black people, and that fights against the trend of trying to understand things. And I did share with the folks today, and I'll just share with it and move on, of that usually when you tell me I can't do something, that's exactly what I want to do. You know, I'm like a little kid. Don't put your finger in the light socket. That's exactly what the kid wants to do. But I really did think that it's a contribution. I think some of this work actually really does contribute to our understanding of health disparities by understanding, at least in one group, the very complicated way in which health actually shows itself. So Carolina African American Twin Study, arguably the largest in-person study of African American twins, 285 pairs of twins. But what became obvious, I did the preliminary piece of it when I would call, and I did call one pair of twins, and you know, it's magical when you catch them, because we have to go through a lot of hoops to try to catch twins. Adult twins, there's no way to look in the phone book and say, oh, it's a twin. You actually go to birth records. We take the birth records and then bump them up against things like yellow pages and different pieces of voter registry information to try to find twins. And so I would find one, and I'd say, you know, is this John Doe? Yes, this is John Doe. Oh, I found, okay, first step. Are you a twin? Yes, I am. I got a twin. Okay, I can't find information on your brother. Could you share that with me? And I talked to him a little bit more. And 2 different times, I was told the brother had died about 2 weeks before. So health disparities they were screwing up my data thing. And I'm like, come on, you know something? Let's not exclude them. In typical twin studies, it's only the complete pairs that are included. I thought since we're studying health disparities in large part, let's include them in. So I forgot how many, we'll see in just a minute. There are quote unquote singletons, and in some cases we get a sibling, so that we would have something else to be able to kind of compare them to, which we still need to do. Done in North Carolina, home interviews, focusing on health factors, particularly cardiovascular disease, memory, physical performance, mental health, kind of personality, and social factors. So the sample looks like this. And just one quick thing to point out, so there are more identical twins more fraternal twins than identical twins. In most twin studies, it's the other way around. It shouldn't be. Actually, the rate of twinning is about 2 to 1 in terms of more fraternal twins than identical twins. But identical twins like being identical twins. And so they typically accept at a higher rate than fraternal twins, and that's why other people's stuff is a little biased. Mine, of course, is correct and right. Okay? So let's take a look. Show you a little bit more. So it's so great. This is the first time, this part of the map actually matters. This is us down here. This is most of where our twins are, and one of the things that you'll notice about it is that they are both in population centers as well as in rural areas. And so that is a whole nother analysis. I've tried to do it. It's interesting. There's a few things that come out of looking at the differences that might show in terms of health of whether you live in a rural situation or rather than an urban situation. The couple that I've looked at, the people in rural situations are actually doing better than the people in urban situations. And another opportunity for a teachable moment. One of the things that, I think I shared this earlier, it's just so easy. When you give a talk, just give the talk earlier and then just give it again. You say the same things over and over again. Is that I designed the study to focus on very specific things. I don't even remember, mostly about the health piece of it and then the cognitive piece of it. But in all of my studies, get the grant on the things that you can actually sell because it has such a scientific basis, you can argue it back and forth. But then I never limit myself to that. There are over 800 variables in this. I think we proposed probably 20. But it gives me the advantage of that this study ended in 2003 and we still publish off of it. There are still unique pieces of information, revelations to be made off of taking a look at the study. So, lesson to be learned. Sell what you can sell and then get more. This is what I learned when I was at the University of Colorado, which is how to do structure equation modeling or biometrical modeling. And that is that when you look at twins, you can look and make assumptions about identical twins, monozygotic twins. That means that they come from one egg and that they share 100% of their segregating genes. If they're a fraternal twin, like our special guest, they share on average half. So we can do some mathematical modeling and say how much then is genetic, how much is shared environment, because we assume that that would be exactly identical, and then non-shared. I will say that there is a terrible fallacy here, and that is that we take it from taking out the variance that's genetic and then environmental, and the remainder is non-shared. The non-shared is not a trivial piece. There's actually even error written into that component of it, but it makes for interesting talks. So follow me, if you will, to taking a look at several health indices. What do we have up there? We have hemodynamics, we have smoking, and we have BMI and waist circumference. All things that we know lead to and contribute to or indicators of chronic health conditions. What you find as you look across them, except for waist circumference, is that, boy, it's a little bit of a mixed bag, of that sometimes the environment actually is higher in proportion of what's actually contributing to variability than genetics, I think is that what I said. For blood pressure, you see it depends on what the measure is, and even for smoking, depends on how you look at smoking. I also have some things on psychosocial measures, depression, cognitive status, and perceived stress and coping. The perceived stress and coping are kind of what you would assume, which is that environment makes a lot more impact than genetics do. But isn't it interesting that genetics are even a part of it in the first place? So, something to think about. This is one of my favorite, there is a paper actually for this, I should have put the citation down there, that there's shared environmental. Most of it comes out so that the shared environment just drops out as a component. But for the cognitive status, it actually hangs in there. And so there may be something that happens in a familial environment. Think about it. We study these twins from 22 to 89, or the twin pairs. So there's different amounts of time that they lived in the same household, and then there's amount of time that they lived and went apart. And that's what usually happens. It's either graduating from school or getting married. And then they kind of go their separate ways and they create different households. What's fascinating is like the women, so I'm going to tell you the story about the women, those 89-year-old women. So they did the same thing. I think when one of them got married when she was 17. So she got married and her sister lived 5 miles away. She just went way off the other side of the earth, okay? Well, sure enough, the woman's husband died, who was married. She then moved back in with her. And they passed away at 91. and within 6 months of one another. Very sad. They weren't mean, but they were, you could see they were very particular. But just fascinating story about how, think about your brothers and sisters. What is it going to look like when you get older? What is it going to be like? Where do they live? And will there be a need? Will there be a desire to come back together? Twins, because they were so special, I think, when they were younger, I think it's an attraction for them. And then when you have things happen as you grow older, when you might need, they were both physically functioning, didn't have, hypertension, but, no real serious problems. I think that they died of quote-unquote natural causes, both even cognitively intact. But there was that attraction to come back and live together, and I think that they enjoyed the last years of their life. So the results, to try to sum it up, that health disparities is a family affair. We study health disparities as individuals, but there are different environmental pieces coming from the same family. Even the genetic piece is a family affair. You got those genes from your parents, and they are contributing to health that you experience in later life. So now I want to share with you my last big question. I feel like I should give that last talk where I say my last big question, but I've done this now 4 times where I say, oh, it's my last big question. It's my last big question because honestly, students, I'll tell you, I really only had 3 really big ideas. And this is the third one. This is the third study. This is the big one. And it came from actually having done other research where I started really kind of wondering what was going on. So this is one of the things that I observed is I was looking at something called fluid and crystallized ability and cognitive functioning. Fluid abilities are ones that are supposed to change and drop down and basically end as we get older. And crystallized are supposed to stay fairly consistent. There's some truth to that. Crystallized are kind of fair. But take a look at this group. This is not, it drops, but then it's starting to plane out. And if I had enough people, actually I do, I should go back and replot this. What you see is that there's almost no drop. And I was like, what in the world is going on? I said, well, the first thing's going on is a selection effect. People are dying off, and so the ones who are dead are not showing up at the 80-year-old mark, but they're as good as the one at the 70-year-old mark. So there's some kind of selection effect. Those people who are living long with okay cognition. I think it's interesting. If you ask students, would you like to live till you're 90? A lot of them say, oh, I don't want to be that old because all my friends will be dead and I won't know where I'm at. And it's like, well, if you live that long, probably not. Now your friends may all be dead, but what you see is that the people who are living those long lives are doing pretty well. They're not debilitated for years and years and years. Those things that debilitate them typically take them out. So very interesting, that kind of jumped in. I went back to that black-white disadvantage piece and said, yeah, who are these people? How in the world do you, from the probability that you may only live this long to being able to live down here, who are those people? And, think about it. So we're talking about health differentials. These are people that they're not only within their group, kind of living beyond what you might predict, across the population, they are living longer than what you would predict. So there must be something magical about those folks. For our community members, when you find people who are 90, you just need to come up to them and say, what are you doing? What is it that you're doing? Because I just think that there's something magical there. Now, one of the things that I think is magical is that they know how to handle stress. And I don't think that it's just a behavioral thing. I think that they might just be even genetically designed for it, but we'll talk about that in just a second. And stress accounts for a lot of health disparities we see, so that kind of can make sense. And so with those big questions, the real big one is, where does stress come from? Behavioral scientists really have never answered that. You know what's fascinating? So how many people have a kid that's less than 4 years old? Okay, so how old are they? 2.5. Are they walking? Are they walking with assistance? Okay, they're not walking with assistance. Yeah, so this is different, gerontology people, we're talking about something different. This is not the walker, this is the table usually. So they take the table and they walk around the table. Yeah, look at me. I can get into stuff here real soon. But what inevitably happens? They fall. They hit their head. Is it your first child or second child? Second child. okay? The first child, I can probably tell you what she did, okay? Child fell, bam, hits the head. Mother's like, oh my God, are you okay? And the child looks up and then goes, wah! But if you notice it, there typically is a pause, okay? The second child, boom, falls down, looks up at mom. And mom goes, well, what are you going to do? Yeah, you're trying to act like you don't, but you know you don't. Guess what? And I'm a second-born, too, so I know how it goes. But we teach our children things that sometimes we think are automatic. The perception of pain, the perception of danger, the perception of stress, I believe, in a significant part, is learned. And I think hopefully we learn it early. Some of us don't learn it early. We do things that are dangerous and we're getting older. But my thought is that we actually learn it. We learn it in a social context. And that there are lots of things that actually go into how it gets passed on from generation to generation. And it involves maybe where we live, racism, financial strain, even kind of the occupation of the first person, and then that parent passes it on through social learning, through all those other contexts, and then those things come in, but that the environment is doing a lot to teach us about what we think about relative to stress, okay? Another assumption, presumption. This may be one of my last papers that I try to put out there, and it's going to get so much pushback that I don't even care. So I'll just, if I can get it published, I'll say, oh, I don't care, you know. So when I started thinking about a model of all the things that actually went into longevity, stress was right there with them. But I thought about all of the interesting intersections and even how we cope, hopefully to relieve stress or at least to deal with the stress, and how that contributes to longevity. And so, you know, as you see, I like to draw pictures with lots of lines. Okay? It's the interrelationships. They're not these simple relationships that we should be trying to look at to try to solve, answering, and trying to figure out what goes relative to longevity in African Americans. So I still argue that it's my last study, and that is a study of longevity and stress in African Americans. This is our call, and it's so funny. You can say it a bunch of ways, but we call it SOLSA, not salsa, you know. Might be different for a different group. The goal of this project is to study patterns of perceived stress, active coping style, health status, and genes that contribute to longevity observed in African American families. And where are we doing on time? Yeah, I'm about to run out. I want to keep going through, so we'll come back to that. That's the reason why we do it. It's to look at relationships within families, and you'll see it by the study design. Our goal is 750. I'm an underachiever, overachiever. I don't know what it is. My poor people have got to go to 1,000. We got funded to do 750 because it sounded right, but my goal is that we're going to get to 1,000. We'll see how it happens. And we've got two different types of families, short-lived and long-lived. Short-lived families are where that older generation is no longer there, and no longer there because of chronic disease. We don't take them because of accidents. But then we study siblings. So we have the siblings in the short-lived family, and then we have long-lived families, and they do have at least one parent who has lived into later life, and we look at them. So, looks like this. Nobody in that G1, we call it G1, the parental generation, and here there is, okay? And I just pulled this off today. This is our current status. We've got about 2 more years. We've been going for about 1.5 years. We're okay. I'm going down next week to wreak havoc because I want us to pick up the pace a little bit. I really want us to get to the 1,000. It gives us more power because what you find is interesting patterns within families. We need as much as we can. So here are all the measures. Again, about only maybe 1/3 of them were what we put in the grant proposal. Once you get the grant proposal, you add other stuff in. You start talking to other people. Actually, 2 of the people who were on the grant originally aren't on the grant. We added 2 other people, and so they brought a bunch of things. So we just put both of them together. Lots of things, looking at health measures, physical health measures, and genetics relative to saliva. You can spit it, you can swab it, but you can get genes very easily, actually, from buccal cells. And we've done that in several of our studies so far. And what I find fascinating is that, so there's lots of different things that we can do in terms of making comparisons. What if, when we look at stress, that just being a sibling makes you more alike than if you compared just two random people. So we can look at the family effect. We can also look at, or the sibling effect. The family effect, we can look at our two different kinds of families and see, are these siblings different, higher level, whatever, than these siblings are in the long-lived families. And then we can kind of go vertically and say, how alike are the parents to the children? Because if my little hypothesis is right, they should be fascinatingly similar to those children of theirs. You might think, well, that's kind of obvious, but nobody's done it. Not as far as we know, anyway. So let me conclude. See, I'm not doing bad. Hey! You see all the stuff I had to skip. But I have noticed in the last couple of years, particularly as my time is now divided between being a university administrator and being a scholar, and I do believe in the scholar-administrator model. That's why I still publish at least a few each year. Actually, if I have a really bad year, like 3 pubs, the next year is tough because I try to get even more, because I just want to feel like we're doing things. And I've got so many fantastic collaborators. And over the years, we answer lots of different questions. I hate to think that I might have missed somebody, and it's likely that I did, but here's just a small sampling of the folks who, some of them aren't even on papers. Well, no, James Jackson and I are actually on a paper that somebody's working on now. But James, for example, who I think of him as, he's like the godfather of African American aging. We've just talked. And sometimes that conversation helps you to reframe thinking when you're trying to think differently than what's been done before. Because you don't want to rely on only your own thinking, because you really are thinking about something completely different. And maybe you think, this is Nobel Peace Prize winning stuff. I am so smart, I'm nothing. And somebody rational that you trust says, no, that's garbage. And so you have to trust them and maybe go back and think about it again. And so some folks contributed to that. Some folks are like Norman Anderson and even Dana Plude and, is Jerrod Job up? Yeah, no, Jerrod Job should be up there too. Jerrod Job was the one who basically got my first grant funded. And if not for that first grant, there would not have been subsequent grants. Of course, because there has to be one before there's more. Yeah. I get that. But really actually said, I see something in what he's doing. And one of the more rewarding pieces about having won the Kleemeyer Award last year was being able to tell to Jerrod Job, you invested right. That people weren't supportive of it, reviewers didn't get it, but he did. And so it was nice being able to kind of reward that back. I think giving back is one of the most important things that we need to be doing as a science. And particularly as you study African Americans. That means something. That means something to share that information. That means something to actually share your joys and successes. I've done it a lot with the Baltimore study. I've done it some with the Carolina study. With our longitudinal study, we're definitely going to do it. We at least celebrate birthdays because it was their birth that started what we have to be able to try to share and to think about how we can improve lives, not just for African Americans, but for everybody. I go back to the point of that. If you can find the group that has the highest probability of not being here, who's there, there's probably something interesting about them that might benefit everyone. So, with that, that was an extra slide I put in there, just in case somebody asked hard questions. So don't ask any hard questions. I will stop there. Thank you so very, very much.
Start off, have any of your studies examined identical twins separated at birth and unaware of each other?
No, and that's because for African Americans at the time span that we have, that very seldom happened. In Sweden, which I have wonderful colleagues in Sweden, that was done as a government social program. In African American families, because they didn't benefit from it, think about it. You have to go back from 1997 and go back, let's go back 70 years. We're talking about the 1920s. Got to do my math here on my feet. we didn't care about African-American families. And so what would happen is, and actually I can tell you a really interesting story. So we had two gentlemen in their 50s when they were born, on the day they were born, the first one came out, and when the child came out, it was blue. Anybody has any experience in midwifery knows blue baby means that lack of oxygen, baby's died. Midwife tells the mother, I'm sorry, first baby didn't make it, but you got another one, let's think about that. Takes the baby, I don't know why, I remember this of all the stories, puts the baby on the windowsill, goes back, come on, push, get a second baby, baby's healthy. She's like, oh, thank goodness. But she looks over and sees her baby and says, can you do something with the baby? When the midwife goes back over to get the baby's no longer blue. Baby's alive. She's like, well, you got two babies. And she's like, she's excited. So interestingly enough, the mother passes away when the children are about 13. And what happens is that the one who was blue was thought to be sickly. Everybody heard the story. So the family in North Carolina that could take one child took the sickly one so it didn't have to travel. And the other one went to Philadelphia. Philly. You know how this is going to turn out. Now in their 50s, what you find is that the blue baby runs marathons, low cholesterol, no hypertension. Other baby, left ventricular hypertrophy, hypertension, and some other things. The power of the environment, the power of maybe a few genes that started that baby and brought him back, but just interesting story. But those are the kinds of separations that we'd have. They knew each other. It was family, it's extended family that took them, so they keep them connected, but it was the cost of raising a child where they were then separated. We even have very few of those. We may have missed some. I mean, some because we got ones who were surviving members. There might have been some of those, but there was not the same government program. I have colleagues that work with Minnesota Twin Study, and that's another one where the state of Minnesota would actually take and separate children so that they could place them because families didn't want to take two children. But we didn't have that same thing. At least we didn't have the same thing in North Carolina. Yes, sir.
Did you look at racial discrimination, stress, and issues around resiliency, and how that may relate to allostatic load, weathering, and all those things that are infamous in the African American?
I'm so glad we've got the new study because we are now. We didn't before. Allostatic load wasn't that, and we started in '97. It was one that Bruce McEwen and some others were really starting then. And we had it in an early version of that grant and couldn't get it. But I think that it's probably critical as you're trying to think about the path and the course of health and chronic health and how it changes and how it deteriorates. Those are the things that you'd like to have. Now, what I'll say is that even in this one, we don't have allostatic load because in part, you need blood. Now, it may be different in other Carolina, but in my Carolina and North Carolina, African Americans are not big on giving blood. We were told, I did several little trials, and this saying stuck with me, and that is that you don't give away your mud. Now, anybody know why? Because what? Well, and you got to be careful because we know more about the atrocities that have been done now than we did then, but it's a long-standing thing. It's because you didn't give away your mud because people could do things to you, okay? If somebody had your blood, yeah, see, I'm looking at the people that are over 25 who are in our audience, and some of them are shaking their head like, yeah, no, you don't give your blood to nobody. That is just, and it's not even everybody. And I will have places like in Boston, I've had them say, oh, well, we get African Americans to give blood all the time. And I'll go, and so who are they? Because they're, I think, the fringe and not necessarily representing the core. It is one of those things. It's changing a little bit. We're doing better in terms of the health profession integrating with African American populations. It's not great, but it's better than it was. I think about in North Carolina, there used to be only certain hospitals. Like when we went up to the northeast part of North Carolina, it was interesting because there was a hospital in like Halifax County that had people from Virginia come there because they couldn't go to the hospital in Virginia. So there were only these little kind of pockets. And so if you can imagine, if you can't just go to a hospital and be treated, if you can't go to a hospital and have, you know, there's a certain belief and mistrust of the medical system. Well, the idea of somebody coming in and, you know, it's a phlebotomist and, you know, they have the little white coat, those are all the things of people that, well, so what are you going to do with this? And it is, as I go back to our caregiving conversations, that is an interesting complication of the cultural beliefs that one generation have that the other generation doesn't have. And so again, while that's changing, there's still a little bit of that there. So that's what part of the challenge at least was. For me it was, I'd have to pay I never say it right, a phlebologist. They're expensive. I paid my staff really fairly well, but that extra piece is different. It's actually more expensive. So to be able to get them, process them, all of that. Our study, people were pushing back that we were going to collect genes alone. And now we had an 89% acceptance rate. But there were 11% who were like, nuh-uh, what you going to do? What do you want to do with this? And when you try to be transparent and share, I'd wonder too. I wouldn't wonder because I do it, but you know, you might wonder. Okay. Any other questions? The food and reception is not that good, so we just.
Two more questions, yes.
So you've done some really interesting studies looking at siblings and twins, and it seems like you've delved a little bit into family structure. And I was wondering if you've seen any difference in lifespan between people who have siblings and who don't have siblings. I have two younger brothers, so figured they might have taken a couple years off my life. Yeah,
You're trying to help your brothers and sisters out. You know, they are such a good sister. I took it out of here because I didn't think I was going to have enough time. Before I started the last study, I did take a look and see, when we looked at our twins, if they had, I can't remember the pattern, but if they had a sibling who had passed, actually, let me see. Nah, I don't think it's there. Nope, okay. We did see a pattern of if you had a sibling who was still alive, like the next generation, the more siblings you had alive, the higher the probability that you had fewer chronic conditions. So it's kind of like healthy families. And there really hasn't been a study, a big study at least in African Americans, of looking at centenarians and really, really long-lived family types. But that's what you tend to find, is that there is this if you have a sibling that lives to 100, it significantly increases your probability of living to 100. Whether that happens in African Americans, we're going to have some evidence of that. I think we have two 100-year-olds. And we're just beating the bush. My poor people, I feel sorry for them. Because I'm always harassing saying, haven't you found anybody who's older than that? We actually use voter registration records. So that's how we start. And for one county, there's like 36,000 names for people over the age of 50. So they're going through each one and calling them and trying to find information on them. And of course, we start with the very oldest. And so when I know we're changing to another county, I go, how's it going? Did you find anybody? And I think that they're out there. I just, you know, voter registry records are not the perfect population-based study. We are using them because we think that there's a huge Obama effect, of that lots of people registered to vote because we had a black president. And when you, actually, I can compare them to what it looked like in 1997, and it did increase by about 14%. So we have more, at least, names to try to sample from. But yes, there's a family effect there. Take care of your siblings. Make sure they're, how you doing today? You feeling good? Okay. Is there another question?
One more question, yes?
So it seems like you've got a lot of really great personal stories from especially the Carolina patient study. So I didn't know if you had ever specifically gone back and shared any of your findings from that studies with participants and gotten their feedback at all?
Not by their feedback, but share with them some of the things that we find. When funding runs out, it gets tough, so we did it once, said some highlights of some things, and as I said, we ended it in 2003, and I think we did that in 4 or 5. And then what the tough part is that actually people move. I was in Penn State. I got a problem. I never do studies where I'm at. I actually did the Carolina study from Penn State, and I'm doing the next North Carolina study from Wayne State. Just, I don't want to do it easy, I guess. So it was interesting, when I got there in 2006, I said, hey, let's see how many of the really old ones we can find. And most of the stories we found, they had moved. They had moved to try to be closer to their grandkids. Or they passed away. That's how I know actually both the oldest men and the oldest women, both of them have passed away. So, you know, we did it, like I said, in 04, I think, or 05. And it was when I didn't know I was going back to North Carolina either. So we didn't keep track of them, but we did do that one. Where we do a better job, or what we've done a better job, was in the Baltimore Study. We had a regular newsletter. And I always thought that that was just, you know, we make things like, you know, I lost my keys, you know, and talk about the memory things that we found in our study. And I always thought, you know something, nobody cares about this stupid thing. I'm writing these goofy things that I really don't even, you know, I'm not a writer like that, and nobody really cares. So we did it for one of our studies that we did it early on. We were doing it, and then I stopped because we didn't have the money for it. We go back for the next study, and we go to one of the places that we went to, and we weren't recruiting one of the people that participated before. It was somebody else. They heard it was the Baltimore Study, and they said, excuse me, I haven't gotten my newsletter lately. And I was like, really? You know, you actually want, oh, I like it. And you know what they liked? Very simple, strange thing. At the very top in the header, I don't even know where I got it from. I used to have these little sayings, like count your blessings, not your crosses. Count your wins, not your losses. They loved that little tagline for things. And the trouble was, is I ran out of them. It was like, I've only got like 10. So we did it for about 2.5 years, and then we stopped, and then when we went back, we were trying to do some, but again, I probably just am not a good enough grant writer, because I should have written that in and I didn't write it in. But we ended up being, actually, I didn't show you, in the Baltimore study anyway, one of the things that was tough is because I didn't live there, I had a project office that was in one of the senior high-rises. We were in 29 different senior high-rises across eastern Baltimore. And one of the things that you would see is that they liked it that we were in the community. And so when we were in the community, they learned that we were in the community, we were there for 14 years. When other people, Johns Hopkins, would come over and say, oh, we want to do this thing where we stand people upside down and we shake them, and we just want to see if your people will participate in it. They would call me. I had participants call me, and I had senior center directors call me, because you give them your number. You need me, you're helping me out. They would call me. And so I'm trying to help out Hopkins, you know. It's an okay school. And I tell them, hey, you want to stand people upside down and shake them. Don't you think you should actually go across 83, was it? Go across 83 and just actually talk to those people? And did it 3 different times, and they never did. And so all it did was make us look better, because we actually talked to people. So we tried to do some of that. We even did a couple of seminars to follow up, where we would have them in their community room and tell them just little bits and pieces about what we found, but not as much as we should. Yeah, thanks for that question. Another question?
How do your findings among African Americans compare with similar investigations among Caucasians?
Some of them match up, some of them are different. Actually, a couple of my very early ones were racial comparisons, but to try to figure out if you could eliminate the difference. And so what you find is that, yeah, you know, poor health conditions, drinking, smoking, they contributed to cognitive dysfunction. And then if I could take the right ones and put them in there, rather than having 2 differences between the 2 groups, I could eliminate the difference between the groups. But I don't do a lot of that. As you see, this takes up a lot of time. I leave that for other people to do. And honestly, what I hope is that the research that I do, I hope that I've got the right variables, that they're ones that other people would choose. And, you know, we live in a world where people want you to share your data. For lots of journals, you actually have to share your data. I don't have any problems with it. You know, you're not going to understand it. I don't give you the code book. I give you the data, but not the code book. But there have been a couple of people who have been looking at doing that. There's a study out of St. Louis, particularly on desegregation, because I have a whole bunch of stuff on educational desegregation. And they've been looking and comparing the 2. And what they find is that desegregation was they're comparing blacks at 2 different sites. And they're finding it was very, very different. Partly because in Baltimore actually was one of the first 3 places to ever desegregate. And when they did, interestingly enough in Baltimore, in New York and Washington, the other 2 places, black students went to the white school. In Baltimore, white students went to the black school. They renamed it, fired all the teachers, but it had been the black school. In St. Louis, it was just a completely different process, involved busing. It was very, very different. So that's up to our next generation of scholars to do.